Okay, so decision making. So why is it that smart people can make bad decisions? I'm going to try and explain why. But first, I want to start by talking about why good decision making is important. First of all, the decisions that we make can shape our careers, our relationships, and our overall happiness. In fact, the best financial decision we make is often who we choose as our partner to spend our lives with. Second, in business and leadership, good decision making can mean the difference between success and failure of a department, an organization, or an industry. And third, in politics, decisions can affect millions of people, and poor choices can lead to some disastrous outcomes. Now, on average, we make 35,000 decisions a day, all the way from the mundane through to the life-altering. In the next few minutes, I'm going to try and explore some of the psychological factors that influence our decisions and some practical strategies that can help each of us to improve. So I'm going to start by taking some pleasure in some examples of smart people making bad decisions. So cast your minds back to 1996. The Spice Girls were #1 in the charts, and a young, unknown J.K. Rowling had just finished her first ever book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, while she worked in a cafe in Edinburgh. I tell you what I want, what I really, really want, said J.K. Rowling to herself while sipping on a cup of tea. I really, really, really want to get my book published. That's just for anyone that missed it, that's a little Spice Girls joke there. So you know. I should also say that my wife warned me that Spice Girls jokes might not land too well on a PWI talk, but we are where we are. Anyway, she submitted her draft book to 12 different publishers. The first 11 quickly passed on the manuscript, dismissing it as too risky. It was a long fantasy novel from an unknown author and just too long for little kids. They saw only the downsides. Each publisher made a bad decision. Bloomsbury Publishing's editor took a different approach and gave the first chapter to his young daughter Alice to read. Now, Alice was immediately hooked and begged to know what happened next. This convinced Bloomsbury to take a chance and publish the book, which went on to be one of the most successful book series in history, selling over 500 million copies. Now, history is littered with examples of smart people making bad decisions. There's Blockbuster's decision to not buy Netflix in the year 2000. Hitler's decision to invade Russia in 1941. And Ed Miliband's decision to eat a bacon sandwich in 2014. Now, in Network Rail, where I work, our decisions can make the difference between passengers arriving on time or late, having cheaper fares or paying more, and sometimes whether or not they arrive safely. In many of our roles, we don't see the consequences of our decisions for several years. In fact, we rarely get any feedback at all unless something bad has happened. So it's hard to know whether we are indeed making good decisions. This is particularly relevant as in Network Rail, we're now into CP7, and many of our disciplines have fewer resources, yet the expectations on the railway grow ever higher. So we have to get better, we have to become more efficient, and we have to make more good decisions. Now, we naturally put a lot of focus on the tools that we need to help us make good decisions. Tools like data, systems, and real-time information. Now, these are all important aspects, but they don't form the whole picture. So I'm going to talk about now the psychological side of decision making, starting with a couple of examples. So I hate the supermarket. When I'm picking from hundreds of breakfast cereals, I feel overwhelmed, and I either pick at random or I go with my default choice, which is Sainsbury's own brand muesli for anyone interested. Too much choice can hinder decision making, which is a concept that psychologist Barry Schwartz describes as the paradox of choice. More options can lead to anxiety and worse decisions. And I think the same thing can happen in infrastructure managers like Network Rail. We have so many assets, so much data, and such constrained resources that it's not surprising we don't always get it right. Even external factors like basic needs can affect us. A study in the US showed that judges made more lenient rulings after lunch breaks, which shows us how decision making can be swayed by some non-logical factors. So let's go through some of the psychological concepts that can affect us. With cognitive biases, the framing effect shows how the way information is presented can affect our decisions. Or there's confirmation bias, where we seek information that supports our pre-existing beliefs, like only reading positive reviews for a car that we've already decided we're going to buy. Heuristics or rules of thumb help us make quick decisions, but they can oversimplify complex situations. For example, the availability heuristic can lead us to pick a crowded restaurant, assuming that it therefore must be good. Or there's anchoring bias, where we fixate on the first piece of information we see or hear, even if it's irrelevant to the decision. And social pressures like groupthink push us to conform, even if it leads to poor decisions. So psychological factors can make the difference between a good decision and a bad decision, and none of us are immune from those, not in our personal lives and certainly not in our professional lives. So considering again our Harry Potter example with our wannabe publishers, they likely fell victim to confirmation bias, relying on their past experiences and failing to see the opportunities for a new book to break the mold. They could have benefited from seeking out diverse viewpoints that might have challenged their assumptions. So I'm going to go through now some practical strategies that could help us to make better decisions. And some of these you might recognize just as being classic continuous improvement techniques, but they're very much relevant. So defining the problem first. Before jumping to conclusions, it's really important to define a problem properly. For example, in Network Rail, we've often been through tasks of trying to identify critical assets to the organization across different disciplines. And if we are asking different people to identify critical assets, we need to be really clear on what the word critical actually means. Not every decision deserves the same energy. So focusing our efforts on high impact choices, prioritizing based on the consequence, ensures that we're spending time where it really matters. Just being aware. So if we catch ourselves fixated on the first piece of information, we should take a step back and think, are we being seduced by anchoring bias? And create a culture of questioning. We should encourage our teams to challenge decisions. We can have postmortems after key tasks to see what worked and, importantly, what didn't. And structured tools like decision matrices or cost-benefit analyses can help us objectively evaluate options based on solid data, ensuring that we're not just going on our emotions or our gut. And it's important to bring in people with different experiences and perspectives. Diverse teams make better decisions, and it really is as simple as that. So how might we apply some of that in our roles? So 4 quick examples. So if we're appraising the integrity of an asset, and that's an example of a structure at Three Bridges Station from about 15 years ago in the UK, So when appraising the integrity of an asset, try to identify whether anything is skewing our judgment. We need to be thinking, are we defaulting towards making the same decision as the last person to review the asset? Would a second set of eyes be beneficial? Are the consequences of failure significant? Are you using available data impartially, or are you using it to justify a decision that you've already made? Now, engineers are notoriously poor at communicating to non-technical colleagues, especially when those colleagues are in more senior roles. Consider the framing effect when presenting ideas, where you want to gain buy-in. Presenting ideas positively in terms of their opportunity can be far more effective. Consider whether your team meetings could include some example case studies of decisions made within the team, both good decisions and bad decisions. Avoid judgment or criticism. Just try to keep focused on learning. And lastly, make sure your line manager does your performance review after lunch and on a full stomach. Right, so ultimately, good decision making requires both the right tools and an awareness of the psychological factors at play. Both things are important. So the next time you're faced with a big decision, pause and ask, could I make small changes that will improve the outcome? This should help you make more informed, rational decisions that lead to better outcomes for you, your employer, and the travelling public. Right, thank you. That is the end of the first topic that I'm presenting on today. So I'm going to move on now to Nuneham Viaduct, which is a complete change of topic, to be honest. And as I say, I hope that each of these presentations is of interest. So I'll jump into the second one now. Some of you might have seen Nuneham Viaduct in the media around Easter 2023, so 2 years ago. And structures, railway structures like bridges, they're often described as low likelihood, high consequence assets. So they don't often fail, but when they do, they can cause quite a lot of cost and disruption. And Nuneham Viaduct is certainly a good example of that. Right, so cast your minds back to 2023. On the 3rd of April, Network Rail closed the main line between Oxford and Didcot Parkway due to the progressive failure of the south abutment of Nuneham Viaduct. The viaduct's a 5-span structure carrying two tracks, and it's published to accommodate mixed traffic, including heavy freight, at speeds of up to 90 miles an hour. 3 of the spans are masonry arches, and the 2 longer river spans, which you can see in the images there, are steel metallic decks, which are each comprised of 3 hogback girders or trusses within each span. Now, many of Network Rail's old bridges have been modified and adapted numerous times over their lives. And Nuneham Viaduct is absolutely no exception. So just bear with me for the next couple of minutes. The structure was originally built in 1844 with a relatively lightweight timber deck, but it was replaced about 12 years later in 1856 with a 7-span metallic structure with cast iron piers and masonry abutments and wing walls, which is what we can see on the screen here. In 1906, what had been 4 spans over the river at the southern end of the structure, which is again what's on the screen here, were replaced with 2 longer metallic spans, which are still in place today. So these new spans effectively doubled the span lengths at this end of the structure, and the southern abutment, which had been built in 1856, was retained but modified and was now carrying a vastly increased load. In 1929, the 3 remaining spans from 1856 at the northern end of the structure were replaced with masonry arches, which are still present today. So we've got these 2 metallic spans over the structure, over the river, and in the top left we can see the masonry abutment, which we're going to talk more about, and in the bottom drawing is a continuation of that structure to the north end with the 3 masonry spans. So records from the time that the 4 river spans were replaced with the 2 longer spans indicate that there was settlement to the southern abutment. Then since 2012, we've been aware of progressive settlement of the southern abutment. And the abutment has been settling vertically, which was lowering the level of the southern end of the deck. So to maintain track alignment, the depth of ballast was increased over this southern end of the structure and the approaches to the structure. Over a 10-year period, approximately 600 millimeters of additional ballast depth was added above the structure and the abutment. In turn, this was increasing loads on the abutment, inducing further settlement and putting additional stresses into the metallic deck. So as that southern masonry abutment was settling vertically, it was taking the end of the deck down, the track was being pulled down, so the ballast was being topped up to maintain that vertical alignment, which was then putting more load on the abutment, which was then causing further settlement and so forth. So the condition of the abutment and the wing walls was degrading but being monitored. In early 2023, interventions were progressed, which included further monitoring, some track bed improvement, and designing geopolymer ground improvement beneath and behind the abutment. In the week of the 20th of March in 2023, the geopolymer works were undertaken, but the monitoring that was in place revealed that the works didn't have the desired effect, and the abutment began to rotate in a way that meant that potentially catastrophic rotational failure of the abutment could occur quite rapidly. And we've got some more images of the condition of the abutment and the wing wall there. Now, I remember going to visit this structure the day after the line had been closed, and there were several of our company's directors going along as well. And I was acting head of structures at the time for Network Rail, and I was quite nervous that there was going to be a lot of criticism of the region around why they closed the line, and was that the appropriate thing to do. But I have to say, being there at the structure and seeing the condition of the wing wall and the abutments, nobody really needed too much convincing that it was the right decision to close that line. So, following the abutment's rotation, the line was closed on the 3rd of April, and focus immediately turned towards recovering the use of the line to reopen to traffic. Due to complexities at the site, the work was broadly thought about in 2 different parts. So first, on the left, was around temporarily propping the deck from piled foundations to either side of the structure. And what we can see in the image is a large truss that is spanning between pile foundations, and that is taking the weight of the south end of the deck, so that the abutment could then be essentially be made redundant and removed and replaced. And then the second part of the works was removal and reconstruction of the abutment and wing walls and the approach earthworks to the structure. So once that deck was being supported, all of that abutment removal could be undertaken and start to rebuild a permanent solution. Now, the line reopened to trains on the 9th of June 2023, meaning a major renewal project was planned, designed and completed within 10 weeks. There was lots of positivity in the media about this, and it really was a fantastic achievement that the capital delivery team in Network Rail and the asset management team were able to turn that work around so fast. But before perhaps a bit too self-congratulating towards Network Rail, it is worth considering some of the wider impacts. So there were 10 weeks of replacement buses and significant rerouting of freight traffic. It was also a key route for engineering trains. So there was quite a lot of planned work elsewhere that felt on knock-on effects from the line closure. And I'm not going to get into cost, but the cost was very high to replace the abutment in a reactive way, such as this, and that's obviously undesirable. So, excuse me. Some general kind of reflections on this. Structures are long life, sometimes thought of as inert assets that have been around for hundreds of years. So I think about 2/3 of Network Rail's structures portfolio is now over 150 years old, and some of our bridges that are in service today are over 200 years old, which is a fantastic, it is fantastic, but it also does bring challenges, and I think the perception that, or maybe a perception that nothing typically goes seriously wrong with structures. We perhaps are guilty of taking a bit too much comfort in that perception sometimes. We're very good at installing monitoring, I think, in Network Rail. And we often in structures capture slow and progressive movement. But I think the question in my mind is, are we good enough at identifying the right point at which we need to intervene on a structure? We have traditionally had the same type of policy for intervention across all of our structures in our portfolio. And perhaps we need to better distinguish between the higher consequence assets we have rather than treating everything the same. And lastly, just as a reflection, are we perhaps guilty of working in silos in our disciplines, track structures and geotechnical teams? And what we see on the slide here is just some of the very slow moving but very real trends that we experience in the structures portfolio, which I don't think makes us kind of different or special, but sometimes it's helpful just to kind of look at this and remind ourselves what we're up against. So as structures age, their condition deteriorates. That's quite a close correlation there. As condition deteriorates, it's not just the average condition of the portfolio declining, but we also find that there are therefore more structures in the poorest condition that then require more management time, expertise and funding to manage. So the challenge gets bigger quite rapidly as a portfolio gradually declines. An outcome of this is we find more work needs doing to these structures, and we find more urgent works need doing, and that creates a more reactive approach in how we manage potentially. And as that volume increases, there's the potential that we're going to see more incidents occurring within the portfolio. So quite challenging long-term trend there. Just going to skip that slide. And zooming out a little bit wider than, I suppose, the structures portfolio in itself, we have we do have other headwinds. So we have climate change and extreme weather events. Some structures are particularly susceptible to those. Budget is and has been very constrained in the structures discipline for several control periods, and all the while public expectation increases. So the demands on the portfolio are very, very real and perhaps getting harder through time. But it is not all doom and gloom. So even though we would like to spend more money on structures, money isn't the only answer. And over time, the amount of data, information, and insight we have on our structures has increased massively. Certainly through my career in Network Rail. The competence of the people managing the portfolio is improving and continues to improve as we create training material and competence frameworks. We're getting better and better at applying new and emerging technologies to manage our structures. So not just monitoring them, but also examining them and understanding the behavior of these assets. And I think Network Rail is a kind of leader amongst some of its peers around a targeted and risk-based approach to managing a portfolio, rather than taking a kind of blanket universal approach across all of its assets. And when we think about just the changes in technology, I mean, noting that structures have been around for 150 to 200 years now, if we just think about some of the changes in techniques and technology that's accessible to everyone over the last 50 years, and some of the benefits that must be having on our management of assets, even though that it's difficult to quantify, I'm incredibly optimistic about what the decades ahead will also provide. So it's not been that long since we've started using iPads for the examination of structures, or we're able to kind of check the condition of some of our structures using Google Street View and so forth. And we're no longer working on paper copies of examinations, but we were 20 years ago. So a lot has moved, and a lot will continue to move. So just to kind of end on 3 slides really, on Nuneham Viaduct, is just some of the conclusions from the investigation that was undertaken into the incident. And there's just a few points on the slides here that I'll just talk through. So some of this I've covered already. Settlement was known to be an issue at the structure, amplified by that change in span in the early 1900s. So taking out 4 spans and replacing with 2 did put a lot of extra load on the abutment, and that was a key cause of settlement there. Monitoring was used on the abutment, simple monitoring techniques. It's quite widespread in structures to use date tabs, and for anyone that's not familiar, it's basically, if you've got a fracture in some masonry, you can slap on a piece of mortar during an examination and just etch the date with a screwdriver into it. And if you go back in 6 months, 3 months, or a year's time, and the tab, still is there uncracked, that the fracture hasn't moved or widened. The trouble is when a structure does continue to move and the date tab does crack and often falls off, if we then just go through the motions of replacing it and putting a new date on it, we don't necessarily get very useful insight from that. The third finding was that access for routine exams was frustrated, meaning deterioration couldn't be assessed regularly. Planning examinations is and gaining track access is a challenge in the structures discipline, as I'm sure it is in others, as the railway naturally tries to manage the competing needs of different disciplines and processes for getting access to track. There was a structural assessment of the decks, and this was a missed opportunity to again highlight some of the concerns with the abutments. There were some holding repairs undertaken, but they were potentially reactive in nature rather than there being a kind of long-term plan for managing that asset. And this next point is again the kind of challenge where some of the symptoms of the settlement of that abutment was showing up in a structures discipline space and a track space, but some of the causes were maybe more geotechnically led because of the bearing on the ground beneath the abutment, and therefore there wasn't really very effective kind of cross-discipline working to manage that asset perhaps a bit more holistically. Polymer injection was used in, I think I said earlier, it was March 2023, and the view was that was a bit of a last gasp attempt to stop the settlement, which in hindsight, is with the benefit of hindsight, you would do things differently. And overall, the investigation found that there were missed opportunities to avoid this emergency situation where the line was closed. But perhaps it should have been foreseeable that at some point major works would have been required. So this isn't at all intending to be judgmental or critical of any of the people in any of the teams that were making these decisions. It's, I think, more of a symptom around the workload and the balancing act that these teams do have. And in this particular region, they have the poorest bridges portfolio of anywhere in the country. So there's lots of competing assets that all do well, that many of which do require prioritization and intervention. So I kind of, whilst I don't think it's the right thing to do, I can understand why a more reactive approach to managing the structure has been applied. And that's about it. I'm going to leave on a slide on an image that I've shamefully plagiarized from the BBC, just showing some of the work that was ongoing and the scale of it. We can see that the track is off the bridge deck. The deck is being supported by those the trusses that we saw earlier. We've got steel hollow section piles that are in place, and I think they had to go 20 meters into the ground, and ultimately the deck will be rebuilt to be supported by a capping beam on these piles. That is it from me. I'm going to stop sharing and we can have a discussion. I think you're on mute.
Switch my mic on and start again. Thank you very much for the presentation. Particularly grateful that you weren't feeling well and you still were able to give the presentation. We all appreciate that, I'm sure. We've had over 200 people watching it, so another very strong turnout for one of these sessions, which shows how much anticipation there was of what you were going to say. I was delighted to have you refer to the Spice Girls, particularly that song, because their recording of it was done in the St Pancras Grand Hotel on the main staircase, and the Railway Heritage Trust in its very early days had just restored that staircase when the Spice Girls were filmed on it. So as I certainly wasn't anything to do with the Railway Heritage Trust then, but as I'm its chairman now, there's a link there. On a more serious note, we have had bridges go badly wrong on us over the years. I was divisional engineer in South Wales shortly after the bridge went down at Glanreed, sadly with people losing their lives. And at about the same time, we lost the viaduct in Inverness and nearly lost all the railways north of Inverness as well. So we've had some very serious bridge failures. More recently, Stewarton, where a bridge was scheduled for reconstruction, and there had been assumptions made about the strength of the bridge, which with hindsight were badly wrong. And a train of oil tankers, the first one down that route for some months, proved just how badly wrong they were when the bridge collapsed underneath the oil tankers. So we've had bridges fail, and I think the materials that you presented in the first half of your paper is particularly relevant to how do we take decisions about when to repair bridges, when to reconstruct them. And Nuneham showed again how vital it is to get these right, or we lose things. There's a series of questions. What I will do is I'll try and pick out questions from the chat and pass them to you. So I'm going to start with Andy Elms's question, where he says, could it be argued that your statement, engineers are notoriously poor at communicating with non-technical managers, is itself illustrating the problem?
Maybe I'm speaking personally from my own experience, but yeah, it's an observation. Well, I think it's more of a feeling that many of us have. I think I know that I'm very much generalizing, but we all have concerns that we want to escalate in our organizations about, sometimes technical things, sometimes very non-technical things, and it often feels like it's the case where we just butt heads, trying to talk at cross purposes around what's important and why. Yeah, I don't know how other people have found that, but it's certainly an observation where I am.
Thank you. A couple of questions about the geopolymer injections, and particularly what was the design concept and was the risk of settlement predicted, and were the lessons learned about it making a situation worse rather than as being a solution?
Yeah, they're tricky questions that I don't want to kind of misrepresent anything with my own thoughts here. I think that we just need to be cautious, really, with solutions like this. I think people are probably looking at what could go right, without perhaps thinking too hard about what could go wrong. But it's not an area where I've got a huge amount of technical knowledge, so I don't really want to speculate too much on that.
Okay, thank you. Phil Campbell asks, has bridge monitoring on Network Rail included fibre optic measurement of changes in bridge reactions to loads via the harmonic response?
Oh, so that's interesting. We have got some sites around the country, but not many, where we've installed fibre optic monitoring through the structure itself as it's being built. And what that gives you the potential for is seeing the kind of signature of different trains passing over a structure, and that's really interesting and really insightful for a new bridge. But what I don't think we have much experience of is seeing how that changes as the condition of a structure deteriorates, because that's what we want to know. We want to know when something's ultimately gone wrong and use that kind of really detailed monitoring as some kind of trigger for intervention. So I think we're still we're still learning where we've got it in place, but it's not widespread at all across the portfolio.
And interestingly, from my time at the RAIB, similar techniques have been used to measure trains, and we've seen very badly loaded wagons picked up on such systems from the dynamic reaction underneath them. And it's been one or two interesting debates as a result of that. Peter Halliwell, hello Peter. Question, in your opinion, how is the balance between day-to-day service delivery and long-term asset management to maintain the asset in a state of good repair at the moment? And Peter says his perception is it's heading in the wrong direction, as the state of the asset is not headline accountability and doesn't feature in public GBR aspirations. Peter and I were both involved in different ways in the Grey Rig accident, where such issues were very, very real at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an engineer and an asset manager, I really care passionately about the condition of the structures portfolio, and it does pain me to see it sort of slowly decline through time. But I think it is a positive thing that there's lots of robust challenge to people like me, that we are continuing to provide a service for passengers, which is, you know, what we're all here to do. So I think it gets maybe a bit harder as the portfolio declines, and I think we maybe need to get a bit smarter about how we do that. But I don't think it's impossible. Yeah, we just have to kind of find new ways of doing things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bill Andrew asks he asks it specifically about Nuneham, but it's a more general question, which is there a case for developing designs for solutions that you know are going to be needed, even if the actual work hasn't been authorised? And he quotes designs, the work that was done during the Second World War, so if something was lost for bomb damage, it could be replaced very easily.
Yeah, so I mean, without excuse me, without necessarily having a view on the specifics of Nuneham, I think there's definitely assets out there where there'd be a really strong case to have plans in place were something foreseeable to happen. And I think one of the starting points for that for Network Rail is, as I alluded to earlier, if we can identify which are our most critical and vulnerable assets, we can start to think about management strategies that are kind of ready to go if something were to happen. Because we can, you know, we're very effective at managing safety. We can close a line and we can make sure that the railway is safe, but it's, you know, we also want to get it reopened to trains as quickly as possible. So yeah, I think that's a positive idea.
Thank you. A very quick question: do you use drones for bridge inspections these days?
Yeah, we're trying to do more of it, and I think the we often get asked about drones. I think the important thing is what bit of kit you put on the drone. So if you just want to take photos, that's fine. In Network Rail, we're starting to collect sort of 3D photogrammetry on some of our assets, where we're mounting that type of camera on drones, and that gives us some, you know, it can give us some really fabulous information for our engineers to view these structures, and especially on the larger viaducts, where traditionally we would be inspecting them with people abseiling down the sides of these structures to look at the condition of the spandrel walls and so forth. Sending a drone is just incredibly effective, and it might not tell you everything that you want about a structure, but you can use the outputs of that kind of drone survey to say, well, actually, I will do some roped access examination, but just in that area, because I can see that there's something I want to find out more about. So we're doing it. there's lots of potential to do more of it, and we're trying to build up that expertise.
Thank you, and a slightly wry smile, because much earlier in my career I remember having abseiling introduced as the way of improving efficiency on bridge examinations, compared with spending fortunes on scaffolding. So what comes round goes round.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any engineering assessment about the fact you were increasing the ballast depths on the track over the south abutment area?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that, to be honest. I'm not sure, but again, I would probably point to where the investigation went, is that the interaction between the different disciplines could have been more joined up. So whether there were kind of discussions around the implications of more ballast, I don't know.
And that leads straight into Maria Bock's question, which is, how do we work less in silos and more integrated across the different disciplines? And I think she mentions track lifts, and are we told? I guess that was there a relationship between the PWI side of the track lifting and the structural side?
Yeah, so our processes should require us to speak to each other. But I think we are all ultimately, or different teams are ultimately incentivized to be interested in different things, and that the incentives aren't necessarily there to interact with each other as much as we should. I don't think I've got a kind of silver bullet for how we work less in silos, but I do think that some of the recommendations that came out of the investigation try to achieve that through identifying a person at an appropriate level in the organization to kind of facilitate those interactions. I think it kind of needs to be led from above. But yeah, I don't have a silver bullet for that.
Oh. Okay. And another one, and I'd be interested to see what you say on this one. This is from Greg Salisbury. What part do you feel AI has to play in future predictions for the size and scale of physical interventions on structures, maintenance and renewals?
Yeah, that's it's definitely a hot topic at the moment, and everyone's trying to become like an AI sort of amateur stroke expert. And I'm certainly still going on that journey myself. But where we have been using it in structures, or starting to use it, is more around the examination space. So we examine 70,000 structures every year, and that's massive. And we do that to identify the condition of the structures, to identify the need for repairs, and to spot changes in condition through time. And by using things like photogrammetry and point cloud surveys, which I mentioned earlier, it creates the potential to then run artificial intelligence over the data that's collected to basically point out defects, so a person doesn't have to go hunting for them. So the AI, we already know, is able to spot, a fracture in some brickwork, or some displaced masonry, or some spalling loss, and so forth. So we're starting to use it. We're starting to build. We're using it in a sort of controlled environment at the moment. But if it takes some of the workload off people to identify where the problems are, theoretically that frees up the time for those people to use their expertise doing the really complicated thinking, like, which are the assets that require renewal and maintenance, what's the appropriate management strategy for a particular asset, and so forth, which is I don't think AI is quite there yet, but giving it a very kind of binary problem, like, tell me where there's defects on this bridge, it's starting to kind of get there.
Right. There's a question about settlement monitoring on the track. You clearly were aware that the track was going down and being lifted, so I'm going to duck that one, I'm afraid. Sorry, Barbara. And Howard Taylor also refers to the ORR report on earthworks, showing some data on reactive versus proactive costs, and there's a link to that report in the chat. Daniel Pike says, defer and delay does paint us into a corner in future, so disaster averting decisions and contingency plans are probably becoming more important. And to that I would add, how much do we find that we're doing things that don't need doing? And I have cancelled in the past bridge reconstructions 20 or 30 years ago, which I felt weren't necessary. And those bridges are still working today. And I'm acutely aware of a tunnel that was closed because of the state of the tunnel structure in the 1960s or about 1970. And I went into that tunnel a couple of years ago, and the amount of movement that there has been between 1970 and the early 2020s is approximately zero. So, we lost a route completely because of that. So there are things both ways. Are we taking the wrong decisions as well as not taking the right ones?
Yeah, I think there's a large group of assets that are all competing for some kind of renewal work. But with limited funding, we do need to get more picky about which ones we actually spend that scarce resource on. So I think the timing of works becomes ever more important. I think the way to inform ourselves better is better monitoring of the structures in the run up to deciding that we are going to intervene on a structure, and that should help us better plan when and how we intervene. But it's not easy. I mean, structures are big. They're big, complicated assets. They're all different materials, built different years, carry different loads, different maintenance histories. So there's a lot of engineering judgment involved in the process, and that naturally makes it quite challenging. But yeah, informing ourselves with as much data as we can, and having more in the way of peer review when there's big decisions and big consequences at stake, I think is a positive way of doing some of that.
We're running out of time now. There's about 7 questions left. Julian, would it be possible for you to look at the back end of the questions and put some answers in the chat for the people who've done those?
Definitely.
Very helpful if you would, please. Okay, can I thank you very much for the presentations, plural, and interesting that 2 subjects that were apparently so different linked into each other as much as they did. So thank you very much for putting them together in that particular way. If people have any other questions, please do put them in the chat, but not too many, because I don't want to totally overload Julian for the next week in writing answers for them. So thank you very much, Julian. Just a reminder again, the upcoming events: 10th of April, the PWI seminar in Manchester on navigating technology, infrastructure and behaviour, and the next lunch and learn session on the 29th of April, looking at Belfast Grand Central Station. Julian, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much indeed for a splendid lunchtime session, and I hope everybody else has enjoyed it as much as I have. All the best. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.